Chapter 8. The Fairy Seers Rescue the Big Six. A few days later, Dick came to school with the joyful news that his father had given him the hay wagon and the gray horse for the next Saturday afternoon. Would all the children in the school, yes, even the littler ones, bring their lunches and go on a picnic? Everyone was delighted, but the Fairy Seers were the most delighted of all, for it was not often that the big boys of the school cared to play with them. No, they usually noticed them only to tease them. So Beth and Robin and Flora and Mary and Billy and Ted and Lucy accepted the invitation gleefully, promising to come if only their mothers would let them. And it was not until that night in bed, after Robin was asleep, that Beth suddenly remembered that Dick was the president of the Big Six and no friend of the Fairy Seers. He was cross about that party in Miss Angela's garden. He had been cross all the week. Well, then, why was he inviting them on a picnic? Sensible Beth, all in the dark, awake by herself, began to suspect that the picnic was planned for the downfall of the Fairy Seers. First thing in the morning, she told Robin. Straight away they ran to Fairy Tim, who was sitting on the foot rail of Baby Paul's bed, singing soft songs to keep him quiet until Mother Denning should get time to dress him. When they told Fairy Tim about the picnic and Dick's invitation, Fairy Tim whistled. Have you ever heard a fairy whistle? He said, Why, of course, they must be planning some trick. It doesn't take a fairy to see that. But I say, let's go on the picnic for all that. Picnics are such fun. And I will be there in Beth's pocket, you know, ready to lend a hand if you do get into a scrape. Well, with their president along, and quite on his guard against the Big Six, the Fairy Seers thought it safe enough to go on that picnic. And they were right, as you will soon know. Saturday afternoon was clear and fine. The old gray horse, in spite of the big hay rick and the many children on it, almost pranced. As for the children themselves, they sang and whistled and shouted with good spirits. They were so busy with their gay chatter and their songs that they hardly noticed the road the old gray horse was taking. But when he began moving slower and slower, and the hay rick jounced and bumped, then they began to notice. They had turned from the highway and were now in a lane, not much more than a cart track, leading away into the woods toward the foot of Big Greening. Where are you driving us to, Dick? Beth asked, a tiny bit anxiously. In under Greening, he answered carelessly. We'll climb up and have supper where there's a view. The Fairy Seers gasped. No child in their village, at least none of the younger children, had ever been on Greening without some grown-up. It was wild and steep and very lonely. "Did your father say you might go up Greening, Dick Barnes?" Lucy asked accusingly. But Dick did not answer that. He began to whistle. All the big six began whistling with him. It was a gay air they had chosen, but it did not reassure the fairy seers. They looked at one another doubtfully, but the big six were trying hard not to look at one another at all. They were afraid they would burst out laughing. "Dick Barnes, let me right out of the wagon this minute," Lucy cried, frightened tears in her eyes. "My mother would never let me go up Greening with a lot of children. You know your mother wouldn't let you either." Dick politely pulled up the gray horse, but Lucy did not get out. It would be a long walk back to the village for a rather fat little girl, and besides, she remembered now that Flora's mother had sent a wild strawberry tart for every child there. So, since Flora, with her basket, showed no sign of getting out, Lucy sat still where she was. But the fairy seers were very, very quiet as the hayrick jounced and jostled along over the grassy wood road, among the blackberry bushes and crowding spruces. At last they came to the very foot of the mountain. There the gray horse stopped, for well he knew that from now on the children must go their way alone. A big, well-fed farm horse could do no more for them. The wood road had become a narrow foot trail that started off straight up the mountain. Out scrambled all the children, eager now for the climb. Yes, the fairy seers were as eager as the big six, for after all, what is more delightful than a trail leading away straight up a mountain? Dick gave the gray horse a pail of water. He had brought the pail in the hayrick, and the water he got out of the mountain brook. Then he tied him strongly to a little spruce tree, with a deep bag of oats at his nose. Munch, munch, went the gray horse. Well, he was all right. So the children started off up the trail, in and out among the firs and birches. But after a time it seemed too fat, puffing little Lucy, that they had climbed forever. In fact, I think she would have fallen back then, and never arrived at the top at all, had Flora not stuck with her and given her a hand over the roughest places. And not Lucy alone, but all the fairy seers would have grown discouraged indeed on that long, hard climb after the big boys, if Fairy Tim had not been along with them, skipping merrily ahead or beside, or riding jauntily, first in one pocket, then another, singing songs to keep their hearts up. The big six were surprised, I can tell you, again and again, to hear those puffing, panting littler children burst into sudden explosions of laughter or start humming strange little songs right in the roughest places. But when the big six at last reached the topmost stretch of the climb, a steep little cliff at the very summit of the mountain, they had all they could do themselves to get up safely. Those tots can never make this, Dick assured the others of the big six. they will have to eat their lunch down there and miss the view. What was the surprise of the Big Six then, when they had gained the top and turned about, to see the fairy seers with their baskets coming steadily on. And even more surprising, those little tots were not making so much work of it as the Big Six had made. The reason for this was that Fairy Tim, all unseen by Dick and his friends, had gone up ahead, finding out a hidden secret path among the stones and underbrush. The fairy seers had only to follow him, but the Big Six, in spite of their surprise, said nothing. What was there for them to say? All the baskets were opened, and together the Big Six and the fairy seers sat down on the very top of the old greening to take out their picnic luncheon. They could see below them, not far away, their own village, in the midst of its spreading green meadows. The village is a lady, Flora said, gazing down, and the green meadows are her skirts. She is a dancing lady then, Robin suggested, for see, her skirts are swirled all about her. But now the lunch was spread out on a rock, with leaves for a tablecloth, and the children were more interested in that than in the village. There were lettuce and jam and cheese sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs. The salt had been folded in the corner of an envelope, oranges, and last and best of all, the wild strawberry tarts that Flora's mother had made for each and every one. The Big Six were glad then that the littler children had won to the top, though they could not see yet how they had, for otherwise the Big Six would never have tasted these delicious tarts. When every crumb was gone, and they had rested a while, Dick suddenly said, "That old trail's too hard. Let's find a shorter way down." "A shorter way? Goody!" cried Lucy, who was feeling rather sleepy after her hearty luncheon. But Fairy Tim, who had had nothing to eat, since there was nothing there that he particularly cared for, and whose brain was working in good order, pricked up his ears. Dick meant trouble to the fairy seers now, he felt quite sure, and Fairy Tim was right. The time had come when Dick was sure of paying the littler children back for that Miss Angela affair. This was the plan of the Big Six. They would pretend to get lost on the mountainside. The fairy seers would then be frightened. Well, the Big Six would let them stay frightened for some time, and then laugh at them. It would be good fun to see Flora really frightened for once, and Beth and Robin too. The others didn't count so much. But alas, for the Big Six, they had planned without the thunderstorm, and they had planned without Fairy Tim too. The thunderstorm came up quite suddenly. The children were only a little way down the mountain when the sky got dark, all in a minute it seemed, and the lightning flashed. Then the thunder rolled all around Old Greening. In his surprise and confusion, Dick did truly lose his way. He had no idea which was the direction to the wood road, where the gray horse stood, tied and waiting for his load. When Dick was sure he was really lost, and no help for it, he stopped and whispered the truth to the others of the Big Six. And those big boys were horrified. They had been sure Dick knew where he was leading them, that his game of being lost was really just pretend. Then the first great drops of rain splashed into their faces. It had come time for Fairy Tim to take a hand. "Follow me," he cried to his friends. "I'll find a place where we can keep dry till the storm is past." "Hi, hi there! Where are you off to?" cried Dick to the fairy seers, who all together had turned about and were starting off in a different direction down the side of the mountain. "Come along," Flora called back to him over her shoulder as she ran. "We're going to a place to keep dry in." Dick could not understand her assurance, but he knew nothing better to do than to motion for the others to follow, and then himself to lead them off, after the littler children. Fairy Tim led his friends straight to a shelf of rock, well hidden under a clump of little evergreen trees. There was plenty of room there for all the fairy seers, and the Big Six too, to huddle, snug and dry, while the rain poured down just a little beyond their faces, and the lightning flashed, and the thunder rolled around the mountain. And any one could see that the fairy seers were not one bit frightened. How could they be, with Fairy Tim in charge? But the big boys, who knew nothing about Fairy Tim, and so did not realize how safe they really were frightened indeed. They had all they could do to keep from showing it before the fairy seers, I can tell you. When the rain stopped, it lasted only a few minutes. Fairy Tim whispered into Beth's ear. She listened to him trustingly, and then she said, "If you will all follow me, I think I can take you to where the gray horse is waiting." The Big Six stared at her round-eyed. Should they follow her, or should they themselves decide upon the most likely direction to take? However, should Beth, just a little girl, know the way when they themselves had not an idea of it? They grumbled and grumbled, but after all, not one of them had had any feeling that he himself could ever find the wood road. Dusk was beginning to fall. They had promised their mothers to be home long before dark. It looked now as though dark would surely catch them while they were still on the mountain, lost. But the fairy seers would not wait for them to argue longer. Off after Fairy Tim, Beth started, and all the fairy seers close behind her. In a queerly twisted, but quite surprisingly smooth way, they scrambled down the mountain. The Big Six put their pride in their pockets and followed. But just imagine for yourselves how they felt following Beth. Beth, just a little girl, into safety. Certainly this was not the revenge they had planned. "Hurrah! Here we are!" Beth cried at last, suddenly disappearing around a thick, little spruce tree. And sure enough, when the others got around there, they found it was the very same tree to which they had tied the gray horse. There he stood, safe and waiting, and the hay in the hayrick was quite dry, and the grey horse was quite dry, for it had not rained down here at all. The storm had spent itself on the mountain. The big six were quite polite to the fairy seers, all the long ride home, more polite than the fairy seers could ever remember their being. And most of the time the big six were so silent and thoughtful that the fairy seers thought they too must be listening to the song Fairy Tim was singing from his seat between the grey horse's ears. Chapter 9. Fairy Tim is taken prisoner. The next Saturday morning, the big six met early in Dick's hayloft. All the week, the fairy seers had gone serenely along their ways, paying no attention to the big six, and much less fearing them. They had come to believe that Fairy Tim, their president, would see them through anything that might arise. Things can't go on like this any longer, Dick said to his friends. Beth and Robin and all those little babies are getting too smart to stand. Why, they're laughing at us, bigger fellows. It can't go on. How are we going to help its going on? Grumbled Max. It looks as though they're too smart for us. That fairy of theirs must be a wonder. That fairy of theirs? You're not beginning to believe in Fairy Tim yourself, are you? Dick snorted. Well, I'd like to know what did help them last Saturday, then, if it wasn't a fairy. Something's on their side. A blind man could see that much. Dick Barnes looked very thoughtful at this, but the rest of the big six only laughed. Max will be going over to their side and playing fairy before we know it, one of them said. But blue-eyed, sturdy Max paid no attention to their laughter. He sat quietly thinking. Indeed, he was so quiet and so unbothered by their teasing that they grew silent too, and watched him. After a while he spoke. No, nobody wants to go over to their side, he said. Not likely. They're babies. Why, Beth's the oldest, and she's only 8. No, there's something better to do than that. He stopped. What is it? Cried the others eagerly. Max waited another minute, making sure of his scheme. Why, get Fairy Tim on our side, of course, he said. Everybody except Dick snorted at that. Dick looked interested. So you do believe in Fairy Tim? He asked, leaning toward Max. I don't know about believing. No, I don't think I do believe in him. I've never seen a fairy anyway. But those littler children believe in him fast enough. And my uncle says that believing that a fairy is on their side, whether there really is a fairy or not, is what helps them to get the best of us all the time. My uncle says there may be a Fairy Tim, or there may not be, but that the important thing is that they are sure there is. Now Max's uncle was old Dr. James. No one would think of laughing at an idea that came from him. Well, even if that's true, Dick said eagerly. "What's your plan?" "My plan's a good one. All that bothers me is, will you dare do it, Dick Barnes?" "Pretty likely," said Dick. "Well, I only hope their president isn't here, on my knee listening," Max said half seriously. Then he told his plan. Alas, for Fairy Tim, he had not guessed that there was to be a meeting of the Big Six that morning, else he surely would have been there, sitting in their midst, listening to the plan. All unconscious of the trouble brewing for him, he was playing happily with baby Paul in the sandpile in the parsonage backyard. Baby Paul had dug a house in the white sand, and Fairy Tim was the little man who lived in it. Now baby Paul was busy making a street for Fairy Tim to walk on, and soon he would stick twigs and flowers up in the sand to make a garden for Fairy Tim to sit in. All this was great fun, but it kept Fairy Tim from being on the watch as much as usual. Back in the hayloft, Max had told his plan. It was a daring one truly, but Dick had agreed to it. Dick really was a brave boy, for this is what he had to do. Somehow, he must get into his mother's parlor, climb onto a chair or something, and reach down her precious rose-leaf jar from the top shelf of the what-not. This may sound easy enough to you, but that is because you do not know about Miss Barnes' parlor. The blinds were always closed there except for the rare times when real callers came. Neighbors, of course, are never real callers. Miss Barnes kept her parlor closed, except for first calls, and the minister's wife, and the school teacher. Dick was never allowed to go in there alone, but now Max said he must go and get the rose-leaf jar. "Why the rose-leaf jar?" asked Dick, still rather hoping he would not have to do it. "Why can't we prison Fairy Tim in just anything? In an old candy box, or my pencil box, or something?" "Please listen," Max begged. "He'll be a sort of political prisoner, won't he? You've got to treat a political prisoner with some decency, haven't you? There are lots of reasons why the rose-leaf jar is best. Fairy Tim can go to sleep on the rose leaves and be comfortable. Then, too, it's glass, and he can see out. But the real big reason why the rose-leaf jar's the place for him is because not even the fairy seers would ever dare go into your mother's parlor to rescue him." Dick gasped. "Do you mean that after I've got Fairy Tim into the jar, I'm to go back into the parlor and put it up on the what-not again?" Of course that was what Max meant. Where else would Fairy Tim be safe from Beth and her gang? Well, Dick had promised, and he would keep his promise. So that is how it happened that Dick came looking for Beth that Saturday morning, with the precious rose-leaf jar hidden under his coat. He found her hemming a tea towel for her mother on the side piazza. No one else was in sight. "Hello," said Beth. "What do you want, Dick Barnes?" Perhaps that wasn't a very polite way to greet a caller, but Beth was surprised, quite out of politeness. She knew he had not come to play with her. "Beth, you can't guess what I've got under my coat," said Dick. "I haven't time to guess. I'm hemming a tea towel for Mother." Beth was glad indeed that Dick had found her doing such grown-up work. Babies didn't hem tea towels. Dick had better not call her a baby again. Dick opened his coat and held out the jar. "Look," he whispered. Beth gave it one glance. "Why, Dick Barnes," she cried, jumping up and dropping the tea towel onto the floor. "Dick Barnes, what are you doing with your mother's rose-leaf jar out of her parlor?" Although Beth had never been in Miss Barnes' parlor, she knew everything that was in it well enough. Everyone in the village knew. Mother was in the kitchen. "She never saw me," Dick boasted proudly. "I got it for you. Somebody told me that fairies made their beds of rose leaves. I thought I'd bring these to your fairy Tim." Beth clapped her hands. "You brought the rose leaves for Tim," she cried, delighted. "Why, Dick Barnes, that was nice of you." In her pleasure and surprise, you see, Beth had quite forgotten that the rose leaves belonged to Miss Barnes, and were not Dick's to give away. "Tim, Tim, Tim, Tim," Beth called, but not in the loud way you call to a human playmate. No, the softer the calling to a fairy, the sooner he hears, and the quicker he comes. Fairy Tim came running from the sand pile. "See these pretty rose leaves," Beth cried to him. "Dick Barnes is giving them to you for your bed. They will be nicer than plain grass, won't they? Soft, sweet, smooth rose leaves." Dick Barnes, you remember, could not see Fairy Tim at all, but from the way Beth turned her head, he thought that he must be on her shoulder, or rather, that was where Beth was pretending him to be. "Yes, they're awfully soft," Dick agreed, pretending he could see Fairy Tim. "Come here, Tim, and feel 'em for yourself. Just try lying on 'em." Fairy Tim thought there must be some mischief afoot, but he wanted to see it through, and rose leaves are delicious to lie on. So he leapt lightly from Beth's shoulder and danced for a second around the rim of the rose-leaf jar. Then all of a sudden, down he tumbled upon the crinkly, pungent-scented rose leaves. There he lay, kicking his heels above his head, and laughing through the glass at Beth. Quick as a flash, you have to be quick as a flash to catch a fairy. Dick pulled out the cover that he had kept hidden in his pocket, and clapped it onto the jar. Fairy Tim was a prisoner. I've got him, Dick cried, jumping up and down. The jumping shook Fairy Tim dreadfully, and came near to smothering him in rose leaves. "I've got your Fairy Tim," Beth dinning. "And now he's going to be our fairy, the Big Sixes. Ho, ho, ha, ha. I'm going to put him in the parlor, way up on the what-not, the very top shelf. You'll never dare to go into my mother's parlor. Tim's our fairy, our fairy, our fairy." Dick was much bigger and stronger than Beth, but Beth didn't stop to think of that. She made a flying jump from the piazza straight at him, but Dick was off, running very fast, the rose-leaf jar held firmly under his arm. Beth tumbled onto the gravel walk and skinned both her knees. The palms of her hands were scratched dreadfully too, but she did not stop to nurse her bruises. Up she jumped and rushed down the path after Dick. But just there, out from the clump of lilac bushes, by the gate sprang the rest of the Big Six. They had been hiding and watching there all the time. They caught Beth and held her while Dick ran safely on toward home. Only when they knew that he must be in the house did they let Beth go. "We've got your fairy! We've got your fairy!" they shouted at Beth, laughing and dancing in a ring around her. "Now what are you going to do?" Beth did not cry. She was too sensible and too brave for such foolishness. She broke through the dancing ring and backed away up her own front walk, still facing those big, teasing boys. "What am I going to do?" she asked in a voice that did not shake nor tremble. "You wait and see what I'm going to do, you naughty bad boys. The fairy is ours. We've got your fairy. You can't do anything," sang the 5 big boys. "You've got our fairy, yes, but for all that, he's not on your side. He's still on our side. You've made him prisoner. That's nothing when he's still on our side. Wait and see what we'll do." But the big boys hardly heard her. They went running away toward the hayloft, laughing. They thought there really was nothing at all for the fairy seers to do now, with Fairy Tim shut safe and tight, away in prison, in the rose-leaf jar, on the top shelf of the what-not, in Miss Barnes' dark parlor. That surely was the safest place in the world for him. "It makes no difference that he's just pretend," the Big Six told one another. "If the fairy seers think we've got him, well, we've got him, and he won't be helping them in their tricks any more for a long time." And that was how Fairy Tim was made a prisoner. Chapter 10. Flora pays an afternoon call. Beth called a hurried meeting of the fairy seers. They gathered under the big maple in the corner of the parsonage lawn. Baby Paul was crying, but Beth was not crying. Her eyes shone like stars, and her cheeks were burning red. She told them quickly what had happened to Fairy Tim. "It was all my fault," she owned. "I might have known Dick Barnes was up to some trick. Of course he wouldn't bring rose leaves as a gift to our fairy, and the rose-leaf jar out of his mother's parlor. I should have known the minute I saw the rose-leaf jar that he was up to something dreadful." Baby Paul burst into wails. "I want my fairy. I want my fairy. I don't want my fairy to be a prisoner." "Hush," said Robin. "We're not going to let him be a prisoner long. We'll rescue him." "How are we ever going to rescue him from Miss Barnes' parlor, though?" asked Lucy despairingly. "Who'd ever dare go into Miss Barnes' best parlor? Who'd ever dare touch her rose-leaf jar? I wouldn't. Nobody would. So there." Flora had not said a word. She had listened to Beth's story of Tim's capture, silently, her arms wrapped about her knees. But all the time her eyes had grown darker and darker, while 2 spots of red came slowly into her pale cheeks. Now she spoke. Nobody'd dare go into Miss Barnes' parlor. Nobody'd dare let Fairy Tim out of the rose-leaf jar. Yes, somebody'd dare. I'd dare. Lucy Newbold. So there. You would. All the children spoke in a breath. Even baby Paul stopped crying to look at Flora and whisper, "You would," with the rest. Yes, I'll go into Miss Barnes' parlor, and I'll get Fairy Tim out of that rose-leaf jar. Flora stood up. But you'll all have to help me. Beth, you must lend me your Sunday hat. And Lucy, I'll want your lacy party handkerchief. My mother has a veil. She won't mind my using, I'm sure. But what I'll do for a dress, I can't think. Whatever are you going to do? Asked Beth admiringly. Of course you can have my Sunday hat, but what are you going to do? Can't you see what I'm going to do? Flora cried in real surprise. It seemed so simple to her. I shall pay a call on Miss Barnes, and she will take me into her parlor. After I'm in somehow, I've got to rescue Fairy Tim, of course, but I haven't exactly thought out how yet. Oh, but Miss Barnes never takes anyone into her parlor. It's just for regular, important callers, not for neighbors, and never for children. You'll have to think up something better than that, Flora. Perhaps your mother can help us. The fairy seers had already come to have as much faith in Flora's mother as they had in Flora. She was a wonderful woman. No, my mother can't help us today. It's Saturday, and she is hurrying to get some work done before Sunday. We mustn't bother her about things that we can manage just as well ourselves. Flora spoke with assurance. And Miss Barnes will take me into her parlor, she went on. She paid a call on Mother when we first came, but Mother's never had time to return it, not yet. She is always too busy working. So, what I shall do is dress up in the very nicest things I can manage, and go and call in place of Mother. That will be helping Mother, as well as saving Fairy Tim, I guess. Miss Barnes uses her parlor for important things, like first calls, doesn't she? Yes, I suppose she would use it for a first call, agreed Beth, but I don't think she'd use it for a child. I won't be just a child. I'll be all dressed up, and I'll have high, fine manners. And I'll be instead of Mother. What's Miss Barnes' parlor for, if it isn't for first callers with high, fine manners? The children looked at Flora admiringly. Well, they knew that she could make her manners both high and fine. Tell you what, cried Robin, I'll print you a calling card on my printing machine. I guess when she sees your calling card, she'll know you belong in the parlor. That was a fine idea. The children all jumped up now, ready for action. "It's near dinner time," Beth said sensibly. "But right after dinner, let's all meet at Flora's house. I'll bring my hat, and Lucy, you bring the party handkerchief. And Robin will bring the calling card. I've got a wide blue sash that might help too." "Yes, come right after dinner," Flora urged. "It will take some time to get me ready. About 3 o'clock is the time to call on Miss Barnes, I think. You can wait outside for me, behind the hedge, and be there to welcome Fairy Tim when I bring him out." It all seemed a fine and sensible plan. Baby Paul had quite stopped his crying, for now he knew that Flora was going to rescue his fairy. About 3 o'clock that afternoon, Miss Barnes sent Dick to the grocer's on an errand, but he had not gone far before he met all the fairy seers coming down Elm Street in a troop. Flora was in their midst. Dick stood to stare, for it was such a strange-looking Flora. On her head she was wearing Beth's Sunday hat. Dick knew the hat, even though she had tied the streamers into a big bow at the front. From the wide brim of the hat floated a filmy white veil with black spots in it. Flora's dark eyes, looking at Dick through the veil, were mysterious and still. From one hand hung a lacy party kerchief, and with the other she held up her long silk skirt that would otherwise have swept the sidewalk. The skirt was Flora's mother's best silk petticoat, but it looked like a regular skirt, for it had no ruffles. It was black and very rich. For a waist, Beth's wide blue sash was thrown about Flora's shoulders, and then passed back and forth, snugly under her arms, and tied with a bow at the back. It was very neat and pretty. Flora was walking like a queen, with her chin up. Her manners were already high and fine. "Hello," Dick said rather faintly, as the troop of fairy seers passed him. To his amazement, Flora nodded in a friendly manner. "Good afternoon, Dick," she said, in a cool, kind voice. Why, it sounded exactly as though Miss Jeremy had said, "Good afternoon, Dick," to him. Dick did not move on. He stayed looking after the fairy seers, whistling softly. They were going directly toward his house, and not one of them had said a word about the mean trick he had played on Beth in the morning. In fact, they had not seemed cross with him at all. Instead, they had acted pleased and excited about something. They were up to something. A blind man could see that. Well, they could never get Fairy Tim from his safe place on the what-not in the parlor. Dick felt sure of that. His whistling grew softer and softer. However, the deeper his thoughts became. Better not take any chances, perhaps. Better call the Big Six together. He put his fingers to his lips and whistled differently then. A strange, shrill, thin whistle, 3 notes going up and 2 coming down. Then he stood and waited. From several directions came answering whistles. Strange, shrill, thin, 3 notes going up, 2 coming down. And that is how the Big Six gathered together in a band in time to see Flora walking up the brick walk to Miss Barnes' front door. When Flora reached up and rang the front doorbell, they found it hard to believe their eyes. Everyone except the school teacher and Miss Denning went to the Barnes' side door. Miss Barnes was a long time in answering the doorbell. Since it was the front doorbell, she stopped to take off her white afternoon apron and put on her gold watch and chain. While she was doing this, she wondered and wondered who could be paying her a front door call. You may imagine her surprise to find just a child at the front door. But at first she did not know who the child was. Flora's dark eyes looked at Miss Barnes mysteriously through the meshes of the floating veil. But when Flora spoke, Miss Barnes knew at once that she was the dressmaker's child. Flora's voice was soft and distinct. "Good afternoon, Miss Barnes," she said. "I hardly dared hope to find you on such a beautiful afternoon. My mother has been too busy to return your kind call, so I came instead." Miss Barnes only said, "Oh," but she opened the door wide enough for Flora to step into the front hall. When Flora had stepped into the front hall and the door closed after her, Dick Barnes and his friends looked at one another in consternation. Was Fairy Tim so safe as they had thought? But right away they took heart. Of course he was. Flora would never get into that dim, shut-up parlor. Fairy Tim was safe enough in the rose-leaf jar. Reassured, they sat down to await events. On the opposite side of the street, the fairy seers were sitting together under the Barnes hedge. The Big Six pretended not to see them. The Big Six had thought right. It never entered Miss Barnes' mind to take Flora into the parlor. She led the way right back to the sitting room. But Flora did not follow. She stood stock still in front of the parlor door. "Oh, Miss Barnes, I am calling for Mother," she said firmly. "This is a first call, Miss Barnes. I have heard you have a perfectly lovely parlor." Miss Barnes hesitated. "The shades are down in there, and the blinds are closed," she said. Flora thought quickly. She spoke a little quickly, too. "Mother and I have heard so much about your parlor," she sighed. Miss Barnes looked at Flora, hesitating. At that minute, Flora dropped the calling card Robin had printed for her onto the plate for calling cards that stood on the hall table. That decided Miss Barnes. She saw now that Flora was indeed a real caller. "Let us go into the parlor," she said, and came back to the door. When Dick and his friends saw the parlor blinds being opened, they whistled with surprise, but the fairy seers laughed softly. Inside, Miss Barnes sat on a satin chair, with her hands folded in her lap. Flora sat on another satin chair, with her hands folded too. Her mother's silk petticoat lay spread around her on the parlor carpet in pretty, soft folds. Flora said, "We are having nice weather." Miss Barnes said, "Yes, the weather is beautiful for this time of year." Flora said, I hope you are well." Miss Barnes said, "I am very well, thank you. Does your mother like our village?" Flora said, "We find the village delightful." You see, Flora's manners were really very good, calling manners. For a while they said nothing more, but Flora looked all about the parlor admiringly. "Your parlor is just as lovely as everyone says," Flora exclaimed at last. Flora thought it very lovely truly. On the table by her side were some white wax lilies under glass. The chairs and sofa were upholstered in heavy yellow satin, and there was a hand-carved footstool, upholstered in yellow satin too. It was all very rich in the afternoon sunlight, and yellow was Flora's favorite color. And there by the door, she had found it at last, stood the high bamboo what-not. It was filled to the top with the most interesting things. There were shells, stuffed birds, shining pieces of quartz, some tiny wax Chinese idols on sticks standing in a green china vase, and many pretty cups and saucers with gilt handles. And on the very top shelf of all stood the rose-leaf jar. Fairy Tim was sitting up on the rose leaves, waving to Flora and throwing her kisses. You may know how overjoyed he was to see her, and of course he knew very well that she had come to rescue him. But Flora, in spite of her delight at seeing Fairy Tim safe and sound and laughing, kept her head. "What a lovely rose-leaf jar that is up there," she said quietly. "Are there real rose leaves in it, Miss Barnes?" "Yes, all from my Dresden bush. I gather them every year." "Really?" "Yes." "How do rose leaves smell when they are dried like that, Miss Barnes?" "Why, they smell—" Miss Barnes could not exactly describe how they did smell. "Why not smell them and see for yourself?" she said kindly. Flora was delighted. Miss Barnes got up and carefully reached down the rose-leaf jar. Not being a fairy seer, she could not see Fairy Tim dancing on the rose leaves. She thought that all the shining in Flora's face was for the rose-leaf jar and the rose leaves in it. The minute Flora had lifted the cover, out leaped Fairy Tim, of course, and went springing about the room in delight over his freedom. Finally he came back and ran up and down the long silken folds of Flora's skirts, turning somersaults, sliding and prancing. Then a springing jump landed him right in Miss Barnes' lap, where he sat during the rest of the call, his arms wrapped about his knees, grinning at Flora. Flora, of course, had all she could do to keep from laughing outright at seeing Fairy Tim there so comfortable and jolly, with Miss Barnes never knowing. When Flora thought that about 15 minutes had passed, she rose to go. Miss Barnes walked with her to the front door. "Thank your mother, Flora, for this call," she said, "and tell her that I shall return it soon." Miss Barnes was thinking to herself all the while she spoke, "Flora is a nice child. I have never seen such beautiful manners in just a child." When Flora came out of the front door, Fairy Tim was riding high and safe on the brim of Beth's Sunday hat. How the fairy seers shouted for joy when they saw him, how they danced, how they pranced with victory. The Big Six, of course, could not help but know that Fairy Tim had been rescued and was there dancing with the little children, even if they couldn't see him. Once more those little children had got the best of them. "It's all that Flora's doing," Max complained. "Nobody could get the best of her. Remember that day she climbed the big tree in the pasture? But Fairy Tim's all pretend." "There isn't any fairy at all, of course," Dick grumbled. "Why do we let them pretend they've rescued him?" "Whether he's pretend or not," Max said fairly, "Flora did get into your mother's parlor, and I'll wager she got her to open the rose-leaf jar too. So even pretending, they've rescued him fair enough. My uncle would say so, and he did say so, just as Max had known he would, that evening when Max told him the whole story. He slapped his knee and chuckled heartily. "Yes, those little children beat you at your own game. Fair enough," he said, "and they've a right to their pretending." Dr. James sat watching the fireflies flickering among his maples for a while in silence. Max watched them too. After a while, old Dr. James finished his sentence. "If it is pretending," he said. Chapter 11. Beth Meets the Princess. Fairy Tim's next adventure was very different, and Beth liked it much better. Dolores, whom you remember, the children had gone to play with on the Sunday that they discovered Fairy Tim, had been taken abroad early that spring, and the big house on the hill was rented to a family from the city. There were 2 children, a little girl Beth's age, and a baby. The minute the Denning children caught a glimpse of the little girl, they called her Princess, and in fact never called her anything else, even after they came to know her. The Princess had long, floating, wavy hair, a very pretty face, and she always wore white dresses, white socks, and white sandals. She owned a pony and a pony cart, and that is how the children first saw her, driving through the village street with her governess. But until this time, none of the village children had played with the princess, or even spoken to her, for she was strange, and they were shy. But Beth and Fairy Tim put an end to all the strangeness, and made friends with the princess and her mother, and all the village children were allowed to play with the princess, the pony, and the pony cart. This was the way of it. One afternoon in May, Beth was sitting on the gate post, swinging her legs and humming over little songs after Fairy Tim, who was perched on the opposite gate post, expounding fairy truth. Beth stopped her songs when Dr. James came driving by. "Good afternoon, Dr. James," she called out merrily. For children were always sure of a warm greeting from the old doctor. He had been so deep in his own thoughts, however, that he had not seen her, but he recognized her voice and answered instantly. "Good afternoon, Beth Denning," even while he looked around to see where the voice came from. "Oh, there you are. Hop in and drive with me, won't you?" It was a great treat to ride with the doctor, and Beth, forgetting all about Fairy Tim and his fairy truth for the minute, jumped down from the post and was in the buggy beside the doctor in a twinkling. But Fairy Tim could be as twinkling as she. He was already in the doctor's pocket. "I'm going up to the big house on the hill," the doctor said. "While I am doctoring the baby that is sick there, you can play with the little girl." "Oh no, I can't," sighed Beth. "I don't know her. I've never played with her." "Never played with her?" the kind old doctor asked, puzzled. "Well, well, you can hold old Lincoln for me then." Old Lincoln was the horse, and Beth was happy at the thought, for it was a great privilege to hold the doctor's horse. "What is the trouble with the princess's baby, brother?" she asked. "Is he very sick?" Dr. James' face saddened. "Yes, very sick. A young doctor is coming from the city as fast as a train can bring him. An old country doctor like me can't find out what the trouble really is, but I know what the baby must have if he is to get well, just the same." "What?" asked Beth. "If the poor little chap could only get some sleep, then he would get well fast enough, that's sure." Beth looked up at her friend. She had never seen his eyes without their twinkle before, and just then Fairy Tim laughed. Beth jumped, for she had not noticed that he was with them. "This is work for me," cried the fairy in his happiest voice. Beth stared down at him, for he had jumped from the doctor's pocket onto her knee. But strange to say, the old doctor, wise and wonderful as he was, could neither see nor hear Fairy Tim. Beth stared, because right there before her eyes, Fairy Tim's little suit and tam o' shanter were changing color. His clothes usually changed themselves in the night, you remember, and of course, Beth had never been awake to see it happen. Sad to say, yesterday had been a rather dull day for Fairy Tim, and he had let himself get dull with it. So this morning, much to his own disgust, and the children's surprise, he had waked up all dressed in brown. But now, all in a second, that dull brown had flashed into a sunny yellow. This was because he was bright again with the happiness of knowing that he could help that poor, sick little baby. "What can you do?" asked Beth. "Why, teach him how to let go and go to sleep," cried Fairy Tim gleefully. "But he's only a tiny baby who can't understand a word you say," objected Beth. "How can you teach him anything?" Fairy Tim laughed at that, until it seemed as though Dr. James must hear him. Perhaps he did, for he had stopped looking so sad, and his eyes were twinkling again. "There's lots of fairy truth for you to learn yet," laughed Fairy Tim. "Why, a baby, only a minute old, or younger, understands whatever a fairy cares to say to him. In fact, the first hour after he is born a baby understands even the longest words and the wisest sayings. But every hour afterward, the fairies have to find shorter and shorter and shorter words, until by the time a baby is 1 year old, we have to talk fairy baby talk to him. Soon after that, unless he is going to be a regular fairy seer anyway, he can't understand any more, ever. How old is this sick baby? How old is the sick baby? Beth asked the doctor. Just 5 months old. Fairy Tim was delighted. He'll understand about letting go, just as easy, he cried. Then Beth looked up at the doctor and put her hand on his. I have a fairy here, she said, who can show that sick baby how to go to sleep, just as easy. Well, are you sure? Asked the doctor. Beth was sure. The doctor, I must tell you, was one of the wisest doctors in the world, even if he was just a country doctor. That is why, although he could not see the fairy, he looked into Beth's blue eyes and believed her. And that is why, when they drew up at the big house on the hill, he took her hand and led her right into the parlor where the princess's mother was waiting. I want to take this little girl upstairs with me, he said. She knows a way to get the baby to sleep. The princess's mother could hardly believe her ears, of course. But until the young city doctor should arrive, the old country doctor must be obeyed. She was wise enough to know that. The doctor and the mother stood just inside the door, upstairs in the sick room. But Beth softly followed Fairy Tim over to the crib to watch him work. By now his suit was so golden a yellow that it looked almost like sunlight moving over the little white coverlet. But it could not be sunlight, for all the curtains were drawn, making a twilight in the room. And then Fairy Tim began talking in such long and learned and wise words that Beth, who was 8 years old, could not get any meaning out of them at all. But the baby, only a few months old, was learned in fairy ways of putting things and understood at once. Suddenly, he opened his brown eyes wide, and a light smile curled his little mouth. That was to show that he understood, and was very, very, very glad to see the fairy. And oh, how glad he was to be told how to let go and go to sleep. He did just as Fairy Tim said, let go in the fairy way. And all at once, that very minute, the baby was fast asleep, his eyelashes fast down on his baby cheeks. But Fairy Tim did not leave him then. He stayed close by, leading him away, and away and away, deeper and deeper and deeper into the land of sleep. Even when he had taken him so deep into that land that there was no danger of his waking for a long, long time, Fairy Tim still stayed to play with the baby and keep him happy in his dreams. That is why Beth, bending over the little crib, lost sight of Fairy Tim, and went searching all about the coverlet for him. For of course, when Fairy Tim led the baby into the land of sleep, he had gone right away from the land of awake, where Beth was. But Dr. James would not let Beth stay hunting for her fairy. He drew her softly away and out of the room. Downstairs, the princess's queen-like mother stooped and kissed her, and then the princess herself rushed into the room, and just as though she had known her always, kissed Beth on both cheeks and on the mouth, hugging her all the while. You see, because they could not see the fairy at his work, they thought that it was Beth herself who had somehow put the baby to sleep. And though Beth told them over and over that it was all Fairy Tim's doing, and not her own at all, the princess's mother never could believe in Fairy Tim. But the doctor, who was so wise, and the princess, who was young enough to make believing easier, did know that a fairy must have been in it somehow, even though they couldn't see how, for the baby was going to get well. And now you know what brought it about that Beth drew up at the front door of the parsonage late that afternoon in the princess's pony cart. The princess was by her side, but Beth herself was driving, and after that, of course, the princess came often to play with the parsonage children and the other fairy seers. As for Fairy Tim, he did not show up until supper time, but then he came bounding on to Robin's glass and waited, as he always did, for his share of the milk. Chapter 12. The Last Day of School. Then came the last day of school. Don't you think we might take Fairy Tim to school today? Beth asked Robin. The last day isn't like ordinary days, and I do want Fairy Tim to hear me speak my piece. You will remember that Miss Jeremy, the teacher, had asked them not to bring Fairy Tim to school again, because he interfered with the children studying. But of course, today there would be no lessons to get. The first half of the morning was to be spent in cleaning up desks, and the second half in speaking pieces. All the children's mothers were coming to hear the pieces, and as many of the fathers as could get away from their work. You don't know your piece. I should think you'd be scared to death and not want anybody to hear you, said Robin, not very politely. He was really worried, because Beth had put off learning her poem until the last minute, and that made him sound cross. But Beth only laughed. She had a way of putting things off, and she never worried. I'll have plenty of time to learn that short poem, she said. My desk is always tidy and won't take a minute. So there's all that time before the exercises begin. But don't you think I might take Fairy Tim in my pocket? Robin, after thinking it over, said it might be all right. So it was 2 happy children and a very jolly fairy who ran out of the parsonage gate and away down the street when the school bell began to ring. The children had decorated the room the afternoon before with daisies, buttercups, and clovers. Miss Jeremy's desk was a bower of green and white. The blackboard was festooned with long chains of flowers, and the windows were framed with them. How sweet it smelled, and how changed the whole school world looked. Miss Jeremy was dressed in filmy white. a bunch of violets at her waist. Her cheeks were pink, and her eyes were shining. How pretty she is, thought Beth. I am proud of my teacher. I am glad all our mothers and fathers are going to see her like this. The children themselves were all in their best dresses, and suits too. Beth's frock was light blue, like the summer sky, and tied with a fluffy white sash around her waist. There were 2 little fluffy bows on her shoulders that gave her a butterfly look. Flora was pretty too. Her mother had undone her dark braids, and now her crinkled, soft brown hair fell about her shoulders like a fan. "Do you know your piece yet?" Flora whispered to Beth as they took their seats. Beth shook her head, her dimples sparkling. "I shall in a minute, though. I'm not worrying about it." But when she pulled out her geography and shook it open, the dimples vanished, and her cheeks grew pale. The sheet of paper with her piece on it was not there. Oh well, she must have slipped it into some other book. But even while she searched everywhere, in her orderly desk, she knew that it was lost. Dick and the other big sixes were watching her closely, and as the papers began to fly, and Beth's cheeks to get paler and paler, and her eyes bigger and darker, they almost laughed outright. For those big boys had stayed behind after the school was decorated the afternoon before, and stolen the poem. At this minute it was safely hidden in Dick's pocket. Well, he knew that Beth had not learned it yet. At last, the Big Six promised themselves, as they watched Beth shaking out all her books and poking her head way down and into her desk. They were going to get even with those smarty littler children, for well they knew that Robin and Flora and all the other fairy seers would feel shamed, indeed, if their most prominent member should disgrace herself and stand speechless when speech time came. They thought they were being funny, and did not know they were being cruel. But it was cruel, for Beth's father had made up that poem himself, and was coming to hear her speak it. And Beth's dear mother had made the dress Beth was wearing out of a party dress of her own, just so that Beth might be as prettily dressed as the other children when she spoke her piece. Both Beth's father and mother expected to be proud of their little daughter, and there was Robin too. Oh, why hadn't she listened to him and learned her piece days ago? How miserable and ashamed of his sister he was going to be. Beth stopped hunting and sat up straight, her hands folded tight together, on her desk. At least she would pretend that nothing was the matter as long as she could. But fairies have sharp eyes, and Fairy Tim's eyes were sharp, even for a fairy. That is why he saw the tears that Beth held back from spilling onto her eyelashes. Now fairies usually run away from tears just as fast as their twinkling feet will take them, and Fairy Tim was no exception. Off he dashed, and was halfway back to Fairyland, by way of a buttercup he was lucky enough to find in a far field. The children had gathered all the near ones to decorate the schoolroom, before he remembered how fond he was of Beth, and what a sensible, jolly, brave little playmate she really was. Then Fairy Tim came right back through the Buttercup door and hurried to the schoolhouse. Jumping on to Beth's shoulder, he whispered, "What is the trouble, little friend?" He called her little friend, in spite of her being so many times bigger than himself, because his kind, fairy heart felt so enormous at that minute. "I've lost the poem my father wrote for me to speak," she whispered back, not turning her head, but staring hard at the flower chains above the blackboard, to keep the tears from welling over. Then Fairy Tim laughed. He was so glad now that he had come back, for he knew that instead of the tears driving him away, fairy that he was, he could drive the tears away. "What if you have?" he whispered. "Oh, Beth, I was sitting on the edge of your father's inkwell when he wrote that poem, and I remember every word of it. In fact, I made a few of them myself. I'll teach it to you." Beth was so relieved that the tears did spill, just for a second, and Fairy Tim ducked into her pocket, with his hands protecting his head. But Beth put in her fingers and gently pulled him out, sitting him on the desk in front of her. Her eyes were sparkling now, and her dimples winking again. Dick and the other big sixes could not see Fairy Tim, of course, and so they could not know that Beth, sitting so quietly and staring at nothing apparently, was learning her poem straight from Fairy Tim's lips. So when all the parents had come in, and sitting in rows on the chairs along the wall, were listening to the songs and pieces of their children, the big six waited laughingly for Beth's turn to come. At last Beth's name was called, and they held their breath as she went up the aisle and took her place before Miss Jeremy's desk. The butterfly bows stood up jauntily on her shoulders. Her yellow hair glinted in the sunshine, and her blue eyes were clear and steady. When Beth made her curtsy, for a moment the big boys held their breath, and then, in the silence, they were a little sorry for what they had done. Poor Beth, what would she do? They wondered. What Beth did, of course, was to recite her poem. Her voice was clear and sure, and she spoke it as Fairy Tim had taught her, not in a sing-song, but with meaning. How proud the fairy seers were of their prominent member. How proud Robin was of his big sister. How proud the minister and his wife were of their little daughter. How proud Miss Jeremy was of her pupil. And oh, how proud Fairy Tim was of his brave playmate. As for the big six, they never did understand how it happened, of course, but deep down in their hearts they thought, it might be rather fun if Beth were one of us. Chapter 13. Fairy Tim is Borrowed. One night, early in the vacation, just as the Denning family was finishing supper, They heard the front gate slam. Flora ran up the gravel walk and went quickly past the dining room windows toward the side door. It was a rainy evening, and Miss Denning thought that either Flora or her mother must be in trouble of some sort. People often came to the parsonage for help, but before Miss Denning could get up from the table, Beth and Robin were racing each other to the door. They were so excited to have Flora here at this time of night that they forgot all rules and manners. Miss Denning did not call them back, nor scold them, for she thought, "Perhaps my children will be the ones this time to give the help. Perhaps they can do it, in this case, better than I." So she waited. When Beth and Robin opened the door, they saw right at once that something was wrong with their friend. Her face, which was always paler than most children's faces, was even paler tonight, or it looked so in the gathering dusk. Although she had an umbrella, her dress was quite soaked with the rain, a blowing rain, the kind that gets under umbrellas. That was surely rain, too, on Flora's cheeks, for Flora was never a child to cry. "Oh, Beth and Robin," she begged, quickly and softly, "would you lend me Fairy Tim just for the night?" Now that was a hard thing to ask of the parsonage children. They felt that Fairy Tim belonged to them, that he was their very own. Of course, this could not be so, for a fairy, if anybody does, belongs to himself. But this was a fairy truth that Beth and Robin had still to learn. Flora saw from their faces how hard it was going to be for them to part with their comrade, even for the night. She hurried to explain. "You see," she said, "my mother is very sad. She is always so jolly, but tonight she is sad. Miss Saltus, the princess's mother, does not like the dress that mother has just made for her. She says it's too tight under the arms. Mother is afraid that Miss Saltus won't give her any more work after she has finished the dress for the princess that she's making now. And mother says if the Saltus work stops, we can't pay the rent this month. You see, we depend on Miss Saltus giving mother work. Mother is just as bothered as she can be. But I don't see how Fairy Tim's going to help," said sensible Beth. "He can't give your mother sewing to do. His days make his clothes, you know." "Of course I know that. It's just that mother has never seen him at all. Just seeing him would cheer her up a lot. Oh, Beth and Robin, you can't know how dreadful it is to have such a jolly mother sad." Yes, the children could imagine how strange and dreadful it would be to have Flora's mother sad. As Flora said, her mother was generally such a jolly person. Now they said together in one breath, almost, "Of course, that's just the thing. Fairy Tim, if anybody can make her jolly again, you shall have him." But then they suddenly remembered. Fairy Tim was by now sound asleep in his shoe box at the foot of Baby Paul's bed up in Mother's room. And Baby Paul was asleep too. Mother would never let them go up into that room now. Just at this minute, Mother Denning came out onto the porch. "What is it, children?" she asked. "Why are you all so solemn?" Robin answered, "You see, it is this way. Flora has come to borrow Fairy Tim. She wants him to help cheer up her mother." Mother Denning looked bewildered. To her still, Fairy Tim was just a pretend fairy. Why Flora should come all the way across the fields on a rainy night for just a pretend thing puzzled her. But she said, "Well, I should let Fairy Tim go then. I am sorry Flora's mother needs cheering up." "But, mother dear," Beth said softly, "Fairy Tim's up in your room, sleeping with baby Paul. May I steal in there and get him, if I go ever so quietly?" Mother Denning looked serious, but the children's faces were so eager she could not refuse them. "Go ever so softly," she said, "and turn the light out in the hall before you open the door. Can you find Fairy Tim in the dark?" "Oh yes, he'll be wrapped in his daylight cape. He shines in the dark." So that was how it came about that Flora ran lightly across the wet fields a few minutes later, her heart singing in spite of the dark and wet, and Fairy Tim sang a chorus to her heart's song as he jounced along in her pocket. For although just pulled from bed, Fairy Tim was not drowsy and yawny as you might expect him to be. This is how it is with fairies. When they sleep, and when they wake, they wake. They never hover in the stupid state of half and half. But alas, when Flora got home, Fairy Tim, in spite of his best endeavors, could not make Flora's mother jolly again. "I'm sorry," she said to Flora, "very, very sorry, but I simply can't see your fairy, and I really wish, Flora, you had stuck to washing the supper dishes, and not run off in the rain, without even asking permission, away over there to the parsonage. That would have helped me more if you had only known." You can imagine Flora's feelings, but Flora's surprise was almost bigger than her sorrow. She had never doubted for a minute that her mother, once given the chance, would see Fairy Tim clear enough. Flora's mother was so different from other mothers. How could she help being a fairy seer? "Why, Mother, he's sitting right there on the edge of your work basket. The lamplight puts out his daylight cape a little, but his face and feet are plain as day. He's laughing at you, Mother." Flora's mother shook her head. She was a little ashamed that she could not see. But it really was not her fault at all. The truth was that she was too tired. She was hurrying to finish the princess's green frock that was promised for tomorrow. And when you are both tired and hurrying, it's little chance you have of fairy seeing. Fairy Tim jumped from the rim of the sewing basket to Flora's shoulder. "Never mind," he comforted her cheerily. "What can't be done in the evening may be done in the morning, just as easy as easy. Let's finish the dishes." And then, while Flora washed and dried and put away the supper dishes, Fairy Tim sat on the shelf above the sink, kicking his heels, making jokes, and singing songs. Of course he did not actually tamper with the hands of the kitchen clock against which he leaned. He was too well behaved a fairy for that, and a missionary too. But he certainly did make the time go faster for Flora. Dishwashing time, before always, had a way of creeping for that little girl. Then came the question of where Fairy Tim should sleep. The grass is too wet to gather for a mattress, even if I should find a shoebox, Flora whispered, so as not to disturb her mother, who was sewing busily, and wrapped in her own worrying thoughts. "Oh, don't bother about me," Fairy Tim answered gaily. "I shall manage for myself. A soft bed somewhere will come to view. But I'm not going to bed until your mother does. I like watching her, even if she is so worried. I'll tell you this, Flora, I never saw a nicer human." Flora would have hugged him for that, if he had not been so little that hugging seemed dangerous. So long after Flora was asleep in her bed, upstairs, Fairy Tim stayed watching Flora's mother taking her careful, quick stitches on the dainty green frock that was to be the princess's. She did not finish until midnight. Then she carefully folded the dress and laid it away in the top of her sewing basket. She got up and stood in the middle of the room, thinking. Fairy Tim read her thoughts, for they were the kind of thoughts that a fairy can read easily. Poor child, Flora's mother was thinking. I should have tried to see her fairy. She deserves a mother who at least tries. Tomorrow I shall look hard, for tonight I really only half looked. Then she took the lamp and went up to Flora's room. Flora was sound asleep. Her mother tucked her in and kissed her cheeks. Then she too went to bed. As for Fairy Tim, his bed had come to view, just as he had said it would. What could be softer and smoother than the pretty green dress, so neatly folded in the top of the sewing basket? Down on it he lay, and pulled a skein of yellow cotton over him for warmth. A snug enough bed for the most particular fairy. Now midnight was a rather late hour for Fairy Tim to retire. That is why he was still asleep when Flora's mother came down in the morning. She went straight to the sewing basket to see how the little green dress would look in the morning light. And that is how it happened that she saw Fairy Tim right away. At least she saw the yellow skein lying where she had never put it. That surprised her. But how pretty it looks against the green, she thought. Why, it is like the yellow buttercups against the green in the meadows outside the window. Yellow buttercups might look rather sweet, embroidered on the collar of the little frock, and perhaps one or two or three on the front. Then she thought again. I am so rested. Flora won't wake up for an hour. I'll not start breakfast, but sit down and embroider a few buttercups just to see. Why, yellow buttercups belong to this dress, and to the little princess too. But when she lifted the skein of yellow, there was Fairy Tim lying wide awake. for her thoughts had waked him. They were the kind of thoughts to wake a fairy. Flora's mother did what a child would have done. She clapped her hands. "Why, Fairy Tim, there you are," she cried softly, as one does cry to a fairy. "And I can see you. Did you sleep in my basket, with the yellow skein for a blanket? Why, Fairy Tim, to think of that!" And right away Fairy Tim had a sensible suggestion. It was that Flora's mother should go out into the meadow with him to study a yellow buttercup before she tried embroidering one. But they did not pick any. No, it did not enter their heads to do that. They just got close to one, growing on its straight green stem, and looked at it long, as at a friend. Then they ran back into the room, and Flora's mother embroidered her friendly thought of the yellow buttercup onto the green frock. 6 buttercups she made on the collar, and 3 on the front. When it was finished, and Flora's mother held the little frock up in her hands, it seemed bewitched. So lovely it had become because of the buttercups. "I hope Miss Saltus won't mind," she cried. Then suddenly, "She never told me to embroider it, Fairy Tim. She may be quite displeased." "Then pull it out," laughed Fairy Tim. "Oh, I could never do that. Do you think I ought?" How Fairy Tim laughed then, and that was her answer. Even so, when Flora came down, and they had all 3 eaten breakfast together, Fairy Tim, drinking from the rim of Flora's mother's glass of milk, it was with some anxiety that she did up the little green frock in a piece of white paper and tied it with a bit of yellow string. "Now, Flora, please take it to Miss Saltus," she said. "And oh, I do hope she won't mind my having embroidered it." "May I get Beth and Robin to go with me?" asked Flora. "They'll be so glad to hear that you could see Fairy Tim this morning, even if you couldn't last night. I want to tell them all about it. And he has made you jolly again, Mother." Of course Flora's mother let her go to the parsonage first. Didn't she owe the parsonage children that morning hour with Fairy Tim? And of course you have guessed the rest. When Beth and Robin and Flora and baby Paul got to the Saltus big house, they asked to see Miss Saltus herself, and when she untied the yellow string, unfolded the sheets of white paper, and held up the exquisite, fairy-enchanted little dress, she could only gasp her delight. But after a minute of happy looking, she found her breath to say, "Why, Flora, this is perfectly charming. How did your mother ever do it so sweetly? Why, she is an artist." She turned the dress round and round, admiring it and admiring it. Then she added, "Please tell your mother, Flora, that I shall be in to see her this afternoon with some more material. She must make all my little daughter's dresses hereafter." You see, she had forgotten about that dress of her own, which she thought did not fit under the arms, and in fact Fairy Tim and Flora's mother had put their heads together to such good purpose that she never did remember it again.